It was supposed to be a night of triumph in the vast, candlelit chambers of the royal Alcazar. Silks were perfumed, musicians silenced their strings, and servants were dismissed to shadows. Behind a pair of ivory-inlaid doors, a trembling young queen, barely out of girlhood, lay waiting beneath monogrammed sheets embroidered with the crest of Spain. Her destiny was clear: to carry the seed of the Bourbon dynasty, to ensure succession, to do her duty. But hours passed. No footsteps, no movement, only a hollow silence pressing against the heavy stone walls. Then came a sound, not the rustle of garments, nor the creak of anticipation, but the unmistakable thud of something falling, a body, perhaps, followed by a muffled sob. When the attendants finally entered, summoned by instinct more than command, they found the king alone. His face was pale, wet with sweat, the pillow beside him stained red. There was no queen. She had fled in terror. What exactly happened that night remains clouded in whispers. But the court began to talk, quietly at first, then with morbid fascination. It wasn't treason, nor impotence. It was something worse, something unspeakable. Ferdinand VII, the most powerful man in Spain, was said to possess a body so unnatural, so grotesquely malformed, that his brides recoiled at the mere sight of it. A twisted member, a royal phallus that some described as monstrously short, thick like a fist, and horribly shaped. And it wasn't just legend. Midwives, physicians, and traumatized queens left written testimonies, each more harrowing than the last. How do you rule a nation when you cannot even consummate a marriage? How do you enforce masculine power when your own body revolts against its purpose? By dawn, rumors had already begun to seep through the marble corridors that Spain had no heir, and perhaps no future. And Ferdinand, already fragile in mind, stunted in education, and raised under the suffocating gaze of court rituals, would spiral, not in rage, but in humiliation, in isolation, in quiet cruelty. For Spain would not only be ruled by a broken man, it would be ruled by a man haunted by his wife's screams, by blood on cotton, and by a truth he could never escape, that the crown weighed nothing compared to the curse between his legs. Stay with us as we uncover the tragic anatomy of a king, not just of flesh, but of fear, legacy, and shame. This is not just the story of Ferdinand VII's broken body. It is the story of how one man's most private curse nearly brought an empire to its knees. To understand Ferdinand VII, we must first understand the world that created him, and then crushed him under its impossible weight. The Bourbon court of Spain in the late 18th century was a strange hybrid, part decaying relic, part gleaming theater. It was a place of stiff wigs, powdered flesh, and suffocating ceremony. But beneath its polished surface lay rot. The Spanish Empire was in decline. Once rulers of half the known world, Spain now stumbled, dragged down by wars, weak monarchs, and a clergy that fed superstition more than strength. In this world, appearances weren't just everything. They were survival. Ferdinand was born in 1784 into this gilded maze. As the son of King Charles IV and Queen Maria Louisa of Parma, he should have been destined for majesty. But even in infancy, something was wrong. He was sickly, frail. His limbs developed slowly, his speech delayed. Physicians whispered of deficiencies, though the word had no clear medical meaning. In a court obsessed with producing virile heirs and godlike monarchs, these small imperfections felt like a bad omen. His mother loathed him. Maria Louisa, a queen known more for her affairs than her affection, found Ferdinand repulsive. Rumors swirled that he was not the true son of Charles IV, but the bastard of a low-ranking noble, or worse, a servant. Whether true or not, the rumor served a purpose. To justify her hatred, Ferdinand was kept isolated, tutored by priests and eunuch-like courtiers who taught him obedience, not confidence. He learned Latin, etiquette, and fear, but never love. And his father, Charles IV, was a man who preferred hunting to ruling. and left most matters of state to his hated favorite, Manuel Godoy. Ferdinand grew up watching this man, his father's puppet, his mother's rumored lover, wield power in the court. It twisted the boy's sense of masculinity. Godoy was tall, handsome, sexually potent. Ferdinand, by contrast, was pale, puffy, and painfully awkward. It was a comparison he could never escape. As a teenager, Ferdinand's deformities became more apparent. A curvature of the spine, a limp that grew worse. His hands trembled when he held cutlery. His voice cracked and wheezed. But it was what remained unseen, his genital malformation, that haunted him most. The court knew, the servants whispered, and though no one dared speak of it openly, the word sterility danced like a dagger in the dark. Yet Ferdinand still had a role to play. The prince, the future king, the vessel of Spain's salvation. In 1802, at the age of 18, he was forced into a dynastic marriage with Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. The wedding was lavish, golden carriages, choirs, hundreds of candles. But the private reality was far bleaker. On the wedding night, nothing happened. For weeks, Maria Antonia waited, terrified and confused. Finally, she wrote in a letter to her family, "He touches me not as a husband should. I believe something is wrong. Horribly wrong." She wasn't wrong. Ferdinand's condition, likely a severe form of hypospadias or penile disfigurement, made consummation almost impossible. Doctors tried leeches, potions, and instruments. Nothing worked. Worse, the more he failed, the more paranoid and violent he became. He began suspecting that Maria Antonia was mocking him, conspiring against him, reporting his shame to her family. When she died young, possibly poisoned, suspicion hung over the court and over Ferdinand. By the time Ferdinand became king in 1808, the Spain he inherited was already crumbling. Napoleon invaded, the Spanish people revolted. The Cortes of Cadiz drafted a liberal constitution, which Ferdinand promptly rejected upon his return in 1814, dissolving parliament and re-establishing absolute monarchy. Why? Because Ferdinand needed control over something, anything. He could not control his body. He could not satisfy a wife. He could not produce an heir without terrifying interventions. But he could, with a signature, crush political enemies. He could arrest liberals. He could order executions. He could force Spain into obedience, if not into glory. The tragedy is that Ferdinand was never a tyrant by destiny. He was a tyrant by trauma. Everything about his upbringing, the loveless family, the grotesque court, the unbearable pressure of masculinity wrapped in velvet and gold, pushed him toward cruelty. And he always ruled with a bitter edge. His face, immortalized in portraits, was heavy-lidded and cold. His lips were pursed. His body stiff like a man constantly in pain, not just physical, but existential. By his third marriage, his desperation reached grotesque levels. In one account, a court physician was ordered to make daily examinations of his genitals and assist him in preparation for intercourse. The medical notes speak in euphemisms. But the horror is clear. Royal sex had become a procedure, sterile, humiliating, and filled with blood. But Spain needed an heir, and Ferdinand needed to prove he was a man. By the time Ferdinand VII entered his 40s, his body was bloated, pockmarked, and bent. His face, once merely soft, had become misshapen. His jaw hung slightly askew, his gaze dull. What was once whispered as awkwardness in youth had hardened into a spectacle of deformity. Even portraits, sanitized by royal decree, could not conceal the downward curve of his spine, the swelling beneath his cheeks, or the absence of vitality in his posture. But the greater disfigurement lay hidden, just as it always had, beneath the layers of velvet and lace, beneath the illusion of sovereignty, was the same grotesque truth that had haunted his wedding night decades before. His manhood remained a sight of failure, a royal embarrassment scrubbed from the official records but etched into every marital chamber. By 1816, The Spanish throne had grown increasingly fragile. The Napoleonic Wars had shattered the empire's prestige. The Americas, once the heart of Spain's colonial wealth, were revolting one by one, and Ferdinand, desperate to prove his strength as a king, could not even prove his function as a man. His second and third marriages ended in shame, confusion, and whispers of horror. Consummation was never clear, and pregnancy remained a dream deferred behind palace doors. These failures turned to desperation. Ferdinand became obsessed with medical remedies, not to heal the nation, but to correct the curse of his body. He drank strange elixirs prepared by court alchemists. He wore heated metal bands beneath his garments to stimulate performance. There are records of painful stretching devices, of private surgeries performed without anesthesia, and of his chamber being soaked with the smell of burnt herbs and blood. None of it worked. His sexual encounters were mechanical, scheduled, and increasingly violent. One doctor wrote in code, "The royal act was attempted again." There was pain, there was blood, there was silence. One night, during his fourth marriage to Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, an incident occurred that would come to define the rest of his reign. An attendant entered too early after a failed conjugal visit and found the queen crying, not quietly, not discreetly, but heaving, her hands red. Blood stained the sheets. Ferdinand sat on the edge of the bed, unblinking. She begged not to be sent back into that room, but she had no choice, because Spain needed an heir, and Ferdinand had reached the final edge of his manhood. From then on, the palace operated like a fortress of shame. All who knew the truth were silenced with bribes, threats, or exile. Physicians were rotated constantly. Queens were watched. Rumors were crushed, but new ones always emerged. That Ferdinand had once tried to impregnate a woman through artificial insemination, that he had paid monks to pray over his genitals, that he kept the bloodied pillows from his failed wedding nights locked in a chest. Like relics of martyrdom, in public, his tyranny grew. He reinstated the Inquisition. He dissolved constitutional rights. He arrested journalists, poets, liberals, professors. Entire families disappeared. The prisons filled with those who questioned his rule or his masculinity. And the more he ruled with fear, the more he seemed to rot. His body swelled from illness and gluttony. Gout, syphilis, and digestive failure ravaged him. His skin turned yellow. His breath was sour. He could barely walk without assistance, yet he clung to the throne like a drowning man to driftwood, terrified not only of losing power, but of losing the illusion that he was still a man. Then came the moment no one expected. In 1830, Maria Cristina, his fourth wife, the one who had once wept from the pain of him, became pregnant, miraculously. Officially, the court rejoiced. Spain held its breath. But the scandal had only just begun, for the child was a girl, Isabella, and under Spanish Salic law, she could not inherit the throne. Ferdinand, desperate for legacy, issued the Pragmatic Sanction, a royal decree allowing his daughter to become queen. But this infuriated the ultra-conservative Carlists, who believed the crown should pass to his brother, Don Carlos. What began as a personal resolution ignited into a civil war. Spain descended into chaos once more, not because of politics, but because of one man's body. Had Ferdinand produced a strong male heir, history might have taken another path. But he could not, and the wound that had bled through his marriages now bled into the soil of his country. In his final years, Ferdinand degenerated into a spectacle. He could no longer ride a horse, could barely eat without choking, and often drooled during council meetings. His courtiers kept him upright, both physically and politically. His mouth spoke decrees while his mind wandered through pain. In one of his last documented appearances, he was wheeled into a balcony to greet the people. A gust of wind lifted the front of his robe, and those who saw recoiled. His legs were bloated, his skin spotted. One witness swore they saw bandages beneath his garments, yellowed and soaked. But what haunted most wasn't the sight, it was the smell. The king was rotting from the inside. Ferdinand VII died in 1833, bloated, barely conscious. Surrounded by ministers more concerned with succession than mourning, they buried him with royal honors. But no one dared open the casket again. Rumor has it that his last request was to be buried with a crucifix from his wedding night and the blood-stained pillow, a symbol not of victory, but of a life governed by mutilation, humiliation, and the agony of masculinity denied. By the early 1830s, Ferdinand VII was no longer a man. He was a ghost trapped in a decaying throne room, propped up by crumbling rituals and the last fumes of Bourbon absolutism. His face, once merely pale and bloated, had hardened into something corpse-like, cheeks sunken, lips slack, teeth rotting in his mouth. He no longer walked, he shuffled, his breath rattled, his voice slurred through cracked lips. Even his courtiers, sycophants by design, could not mask their pity. But the true collapse came not through illness or aging. It came through irrelevance, the moment his daughter Isabella was born. Ferdinand became what he feared most, obsolete. The crown no longer symbolized masculine virility, royal potency, or divine right. It had become fragile, feminine, and disputed. His own brother Don Carlos, a man far more physically imposing and publicly normal, challenged the legitimacy of Isabella's succession, plunging the country into a dynastic crisis that Ferdinand could no longer control. For a man who had spent his life trying to assert his masculinity through power, through control, through cruelty, there was no deeper humiliation than this, to be remembered not as the patriarch of a dynasty, but as the malformed vessel that failed to secure it. And so, as his body collapsed, so did his grip on reality. He developed strange habits. At night, he would insist on being carried into the royal chapel to pray alone, sometimes for hours, sometimes in total silence. One night, a servant caught him sobbing, not quietly, but in violent, choking bursts, clutching the very crucifix that had adorned his marriage bed decades before. In his chambers, he kept portraits of all four wives, but he had ordered their eyes painted over, as if their gaze shamed him. He refused to speak to Maria Christina, the mother of his only child, for days at a time. When he did, it was to ask her a single question, again and again. "Do you believe she is mine?" She always answered yes. He never believed her. In his final year, Ferdinand developed a ritual, grotesque in its symbolism, every week. He demanded to see the blood-stained pillow from his first wedding night. It had been preserved in secret, wrapped in silk and hidden from view. Servants would bring it to him like a relic, and he would place it on his lap in silence. No one knows what he thought in those moments, but his physicians noted that his pulse slowed, his breathing calmed, as if, in that horror, he had found a twisted form of peace. The symbolism could not be clearer. His legacy was not built on victories or sons. It was built on blood, on failure, on shame woven into linen. Meanwhile, the kingdom unraveled. Spain was no longer just divided. It was fractured. Liberals and conservatives waged war in the streets. The Carlist movement gained momentum, portraying Ferdinand's reforms as weak. His daughter is illegitimate, and the entire Bourbon line is spiritually broken, and Ferdinand, too ill to argue, too haunted to care, sat motionless in his palace, watched over by priests and doctors who debated not how to save him, but how long he had left. Letters from ambassadors described a king who smelled of death, who wept during council meetings, who mistook servants for long-dead relatives, who once screamed at a mirror and ordered it removed. In the summer of 1833, Ferdinand suffered a massive bout of dysentery, followed by convulsions. His face swelled, his tongue blackened, according to one physician. He choked on his own bile and had to be held upright to breathe. At one point, he reportedly cried out in Latin, Deus, Deus, quer me dereliquisti, my God, why have you forsaken me? There was no answer. The nation waited. And when Ferdinand finally died, bloated, delirious, possibly screaming, Spain erupted, not in mourning, but in civil war. The First Carlist War began within weeks of his death, a direct result of his decision to alter succession laws in favor of Isabel. His body had barely been lowered into the Escorial tombs before battle broke out across the countryside. The war would last 7 years. It would kill tens of thousands. It would tear families apart. And it all began with a king who could not consummate a marriage. That was the final cruelty. His broken body had not only ruled Spain, it had cursed it. Even in death, Ferdinand's failure as a man echoed through generations. The father of Isabella became a point of national doubt. The man who had imprisoned, tortured, and silenced so many had left behind a monarchy that was fractured, feminized, and fatally exposed. He had spent his entire life punishing others for his own shame, and in doing so, passed that shame onto the nation. His tomb is silent. There are no grand monuments to his reign, no golden inscriptions of triumph, only records of blood, whispers of failure, and a pillow no one dares to display. Because Ferdinand VII did not lose everything at the end. He had already lost it, piece by piece, scream by scream, night after night, on silk sheets soaked in blood, under a crown that weighed nothing against the curse between his legs. History rarely pauses to examine the private chambers of kings. We speak of empires, armies, treaties, but seldom do we look beneath the royal robes, into the trembling hands, the blood-stained linens, the grotesque truths hidden by velvet and gold. And yet, sometimes, history itself is shaped not by grand ideals, but by flesh, by pain, by biology. Ferdinand VII was not merely a cruel king or a failed reformer. He was a symbol, perhaps one of the most tragic in modern European history, of a body that could not fulfill the myth it was meant to embody. For centuries, monarchies had sold a vision of power rooted in the male form. The king was not just sovereign. He was virile, ordained by God to rule and reproduce. His seed was sacred. His ability to procreate was tied to national stability, even divine favor. A barren queen was a crisis, but a broken king, that was unthinkable. And yet, Spain had one. What made Ferdinand's story so corrosive, to himself, to his dynasty, to his nation, was that it shattered the illusion that royal masculinity was invulnerable. His malformed genitals were not just a private condition. They became a national wound. They destabilized dynastic succession, eroded confidence in the crown, and eventually ignited civil war. The failure of his body became the failure of the state, and a monarchy built on performance. Ferdinand could not perform, not in the bedchamber, not in parliament, not in the minds of his subjects. He tried to compensate with absolutism, with censorship, with fear. But his greatest enemy was not liberalism or Napoleon or Don Carlos. It was shame. And shame, as history shows us, is one of the most dangerous political forces in the world. What happens when a man who cannot assert himself as a man is given unchecked power? What happens when personal humiliation festers within a throne room? Ferdinand's reign gives us one answer. He silenced those who question him, not out of strength, but out of terror. He dismantled reforms, not to preserve tradition, but to preserve the illusion of control. His private failures bred public repression, because he ruled not from conviction, but from a lifelong war against his own reflection. It's not the first time in history this has happened. Consider Henry VIII, whose obsession with producing a male heir led to the creation of the Church of England, and the beheading of queens, or the Roman Emperor Claudius, mocked for his limp and stutter, who overcompensated through brutal legal reforms and purges. In each case, a bodily defect became a political doctrine. But Ferdinand's case is uniquely cruel, because he never had the charisma, intelligence, or cunning to reframe his weakness. He simply endured it, clumsily, viciously, until his entire world collapsed under its weight. What does it mean, then, to inherit a throne through blood, when that very blood is tainted with dysfunction? Spain's descent into civil war after his death was not just a fight over succession. It was a rupture of trust. Ferdinand had failed to embody the sacred masculine promise of monarchy, to secure the lineage, and in that vacuum, violence rushed in. Even today, the legacy of his reign is a subject of discomfort. He is rarely glorified, rarely studied in depth. Even in Spain, his name evokes a kind of cultural cringe, a memory best buried, like the pillow he kept hidden. But there is something profoundly human in his tragedy. He is not a villain in the theatrical sense. He is a man who broke under the pressure of myth. Because monarchy, at its core, is myth-making. It asks flesh to become symbol. It asks imperfect bodies to enact divine roles. Ferdinand's body refused, and history punished him for it. Perhaps that is the deepest cruelty of royal life, the refusal to allow kings to simply be men. Had Ferdinand been born a merchant, a farmer, a foot soldier, his condition would have been a private sorrow. But as king, it was a public threat. It was politicized, medicalized, and weaponized, not just against him, but against the very idea of what a king was supposed to be. And so he became monstrous, not only in the eyes of his court, but in his own mind. Because what is a monster, if not a man whose body defies expectation? In the end, Ferdinand VII reminds us that history is not always made by strength. Sometimes it is made by weakness exposed, by silk hiding scars, by kings who bleed where no one can see, by the cursed silence of a man who, for all his power, could not face the mirror or the bed without fear. In a forgotten wing of El Escorial, among the marble tombs of Spanish royalty, there lies a coffin no one visits. Its inscription is simple: Ferdinandus VII Hispaniarum Rex. No epitaph, no honorific, just a name. But beneath the stone, something lingers. They say his body had to be sealed in haste, that the stench from within was unbearable, that his flesh had blackened in the final hours, swollen grotesquely, the result of years of internal decay. The royal surgeons, in whispered accounts, called it a death accelerated by humiliation. Yet still, at the center of the coffin, dressed in stiff ceremonial garb, was the symbol he had clung to, the crimson pillow, the very one bloody faded, pressed beneath folded hands as if in apology. Because no matter what history tried to forget, Ferdinand never did. That pillow, soaked on a wedding night, hidden in shame, preserved through for marriages, was the one thing he chose to carry with him into eternity. Not a crown, not a cross, not a sword, a wound soft silent, soaked with a truth too grotesque for the throne, too human for the myth. And perhaps that is how we should remember him, not as a king, not as a tyrant, not even as a man, but as a boy in a palace who never stopped bleeding, a body crown, but never whole, a monarch of flesh and failure.